On the afternoon of September 5, 1949, more than 72,000 spectators packed Cleveland Municipal Airport. They had come to witness speed, raw, violent speed, at the Thompson Trophy Air Races, the most dangerous air racing event in the world. Among the aircraft screaming around the pylons that day was a radically modified P-51 Mustang named Begin. At the controls sat Bill Odom. Odom was leading the race. He had never flown a pylon race before that weekend. But Bill Odom was no ordinary pilot. He was already a legend in aviation circles, a long-distance flyer who had set endurance records and completed a round-the-world flight in just 73 hours and 5 minutes. Jackie Cochran, the most accomplished aviatrix in history, had personally bought Begin for him to race. The aircraft itself was breathtaking. Its radiator had been relocated from the belly to the wingtip. The lower fuselage had been fared completely smooth. Armor, guns, and anything not essential to speed had been stripped away. It no longer looked like a World War II fighter. It looked like a machine built for one purpose: to go faster than anything else in the sky. As the race entered its second lap, Odom approached pylon number 3 at over 400 miles per hour. Something went wrong. He cut inside the pylon, too tight, too fast, and tried to correct toward pylon 4. The Mustang snapped into a roll. The aircraft flipped upside down. For one frozen, horrifying moment, the P-51 flew inverted just above the ground. Then it plunged out of control. The Mustang slammed into a house on West Street in the nearby town of Berea, Ohio. The impact was catastrophic. Bill Odom was killed instantly. Inside the house were Jean Lyer and her 13-month-old son, Craig. They had moved into the home just 4 days earlier. Both were killed as the wreckage exploded into flames. 72,000 people watched in stunned silence as the house burned. The race continued. Cook Cleland, flying a Goodyear F-2G Super Corsair, went on to win the Thompson Trophy. When reporters later asked him about the tragedy, his response was blunt and unforgiving. Odom, he said, should never have been in that race. He was a Bendix pilot, a cross-country flyer. Pylon racing required a different temperament. The crash sent shockwaves through aviation. The Cleveland Air Races had been the crown jewel of American air racing since the 1930s. But this time, the disaster had happened not on the airfield, but in a residential neighborhood. Sponsors pulled out. The Civil Aeronautics Administration threatened bans. Public tolerance for the danger vanished overnight. The Cleveland races were finished. And with them, the golden age of post-war air racing came to an abrupt end. For the P-51 Mustang, the crash marked something else as well. The aircraft that had once dominated the skies over Europe, that had chased the Luftwaffe from the air, was suddenly seen as too dangerous, too fast, too out of place in a world trying to move on from war. The Mustang slipped into the shadows. Many believed its story was over. They were wrong. When the Second World War ended in August of 1945, the United States military faced a problem no one had planned for. There were too many airplanes. During the war, American factories had produced aircraft at a pace never seen before. North American Aviation, alone, had built more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. At peak production, the factory in Inglewood, California was rolling more than 100 fighters off the line every single week. Then, almost overnight, the war was over. The assembly lines fell silent. The contracts vanished. And thousands of brand-new aircraft had nowhere to go. Across the United States, Europe, and the Pacific, Mustangs were flown to storage depots and parked wingtip to wingtip. Some had barely logged combat hours. Others had never fired a shot in anger. Keeping them made no financial sense. The cost of storage, maintenance, and security quickly exceeded the value of the airplanes themselves. To military planners, these fighters were no longer assets. They were liabilities. The solution was brutally efficient. At airfields across America and Europe, crews began destroying perfectly serviceable combat aircraft. Acetylene torches sliced through aluminum skins. Steel plates weighing 18 feet across were dropped from cranes, smashing fuselages in half to ensure the aircraft could never fly again. Bombers, fighters, transports, all of them reduced to scrap. At Calero Field near Chino, California, a high school senior named Ed Maloney watched the destruction unfold. Maloney was not like most teenagers. While others traded baseball cards, he clipped photographs of airplanes and built detailed wooden models. Aviation was not a hobby for him, it was an obsession. Now he stood behind a fence and watched B-17s and B-24s break apart like toys. The steel plates fell from above and cleaved the fuselages cleanly in two. He later said it was almost sickening to watch. What disturbed him even more came next. Nearby, house-sized piles of technical manuals were set on fire. Years of engineering knowledge, flight manuals, maintenance guides, combat instructions, reduced to ash. One of the workers noticed the teenager watching and waved him over. He told Maloney he could take as many manuals as he could carry. Ed Maloney made trip after trip to his car, loading it with documents and books, rescuing them from the flames. He did not know it at the time, but that moment would define the rest of his life. He had watched history being erased, and he decided he would do something about it. Maloney had almost no money, but whenever he could, he scraped together enough to buy a surplus aircraft, sometimes barely more than a wreck, and store it wherever space could be found. Occasionally he traded one airplane for another. Slowly, a collection began to form. He was the exception. Most Americans saw surplus warplanes as nothing more than scrap metal. P-51 Mustangs that had cost the government over $51,000 each during the war were now being sold off for as little as $1,500, less than the price of a new car. The Mustang, the aircraft that had escorted bombers to Berlin, was now worth less than a sedan. To many, this seemed logical. The war was over. Jets were coming, and the age of the propeller fighter appeared to be finished. But while torches burned and steel plates fell, something important was happening quietly in the background. The P-51 Mustang was not disappearing. It was spreading. The P-51 Mustang was designed for one war. High-altitude escort missions over Europe. Long range. Relentless endurance. But history had other plans. As surplus Mustangs were sold off for the price of used cars, the aircraft began appearing in places no one in Washington was paying attention to. Latin America, the Middle East, Asia. Nations rebuilding after the Second World War needed air power, but they could not afford jet fighters. The Mustang was cheap, reliable, and terrifyingly effective in the hands of a trained pilot. In 1948, the newly declared State of Israel found itself fighting for survival. Under international arms embargoes, Israel was forbidden from purchasing modern combat aircraft. But Mustangs were not considered cutting-edge technology anymore. They were leftovers. Through a maze of shell companies, false paperwork, and covert ferry flights, P-51s began making their way into Israeli hands. Some were assembled from parts smuggled across continent. Others arrived with their markings hastily repainted on isolated airstrip. Israeli pilots, many of them World War II veterans, flew the Mustang into combat once again. It was used not as a high-altitude escort, but as a low-level strike aircraft, attacking convoys, airfields, and troop concentrations. The same fighter that had once defended American bombers over Germany was now shaping the outcome of a brand-new nation's survival. Elsewhere, the Mustang found work in civil wars and border conflicts across Central and South America. It was fast enough to outrun most opposition, heavily armed enough to dominate the battlefield, simple enough to maintain in primitive conditions. In Korea, however, the Mustang's return to war was both unexpected and brutal. When North Korea invaded the South in June of 1950, the United States Air Force faced a crisis. Jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star were too short-ranged and fragile for the kind of ground support the war demanded. The Mustang was brought back from storage. Once again, P-51s flew combat missions, this time diving low over mountain valleys and rice paddies, attacking tanks, bridges, and supply columns. They were devastating. But they were also vulnerable. Flying at low altitude exposed the aircraft to small arms fire and anti-aircraft guns. The Mustang's liquid-cooled engine, once its greatest strength, became a deadly weakness. A single rifle bullet through the radiator could bring the aircraft down. Pilots learned to fear something new. Not enemy fighters. Men with rifles. By the end of the Korean War, more Mustangs had been lost to ground fire than to enemy aircraft. And yet, even as jets took over the skies, the P-51 refused to disappear. Because the Mustang had found a role no jet could replace. It could fly low. It could loiter. It could strike with precision. The aircraft that many believed obsolete was proving something else entirely. The Mustang was not finished. It was evolving. By the early 1950s, the world was moving forward at jet speed. The skies were filling with swept wings and afterburners. Air forces chased Mach numbers, and yesterday's propeller fighters were quietly pushed aside. But the P-51 Mustang refused to fade away. Across the United States, surplus Mustangs found a strange new purpose. They became raceplanes. Civilian pilots, engineers, and former military flyers saw something the government no longer did. Beneath the olive-drab paint and wartime scars was an airframe built for speed. They stripped the aircraft down to its bones. Guns removed. Armor ripped out. Every unnecessary ounce discarded. Wings were clipped to reduce drag. Radiators were reshaped, relocated, or completely redesigned. Canopies were lowered. Control surfaces were refined by hand. Some Mustangs became almost unrecognizable. Names replaced serial numbers. Voodoo. Precious metal. Striga. At Reno and other air racing circuits, these machines screamed just feet above the ground at speeds that would have been unthinkable during the war. 400 miles per hour. 450. More. The same qualities that made the Mustang lethal in combat now made it dangerous in a different way. Racing left no margin for error. The memory of Bill Odom's crash still haunted the sport. Safety rules tightened. Courses were adjusted. But the risks remained, and everyone involved knew it. Yet pilots kept coming. Because flying a Mustang at full power, low and fast, delivered something no jet could. It was raw. Mechanical. Personal. The aircraft fought back. Every vibration, every engine note, every tremor passed directly through the pilot's hands. But the racing world was only one path the Mustang followed. While some were being rebuilt into speed demons, others were being quietly preserved. Ed Maloney's small collection of saved aircraft grew. Hangars that had once echoed with destruction now became shelters. Former mechanics and pilots volunteered their time, repairing airplanes that had been written off as scrap. Museums began to appear. For the first time, the Mustang was no longer just a weapon or a machine. It was history. A reminder of a moment when technology, industry, and human courage had collided at full throttle. The world had changed. But the Mustang endured, faster, louder, and more alive than anyone had expected. By the late 1950s, the P-51 Mustang had outlived almost every expectation placed upon it. It had survived the war it was built for. It had fought in wars no one had planned for. And now it was becoming something else entirely. A legend. Across airfields and museums, veterans began returning to the aircraft they once trusted with their lives. They ran their hands along aluminum skins, traced squadron markings, and remembered friends who never came home. For younger generations, the Mustang became an icon rather than a tool of war. The sound of its Merlin engine, that deep, rising roar, could stop conversations mid-sentence. People looked up instinctively, even decades after the war had ended. Airshows became living history. Mustangs flew again, not in anger, but in remembrance. They performed slow passes and high-speed runs, close enough for spectators to see the rivets and oil stains. Each flight carried risk. These were old machines, maintained by dedication rather than military budget. Every takeoff was an act of trust, in the airplane, and in the people who kept it flying. Some pilots paid the price. Accidents continued to claim aircraft and lives, reminders that the Mustang had never been a gentle machine. It had been built for war, and it demanded respect even in peacetime. Yet the losses only deepened the aircraft's mystique. The Mustang was no longer judged solely by what it destroyed, but by what it represented: precision, endurance, sacrifice. In classrooms, books, and documentaries, the P-51 came to symbolize air superiority itself, the moment when the balance of power in the skies over Europe had finally shifted. It stood for industrial might and human ingenuity. But most of all, it stood for the people. The factory workers who built it under impossible deadlines, the mechanics who kept it flying in mud and snow, the pilots who climbed into the cockpit knowing they might not return. The Mustang became a bridge between generations, a machine that connected a world at war with a world at peace. And as long as one P-51 continued to fly, its propeller biting into the air, its engine echoing across the field, that history would never truly fade. Today, the P-51 Mustang no longer belongs to any one nation. It belongs to history. Fewer than 200 airworthy examples remain worldwide. Each one is tracked, maintained, and flown with a level of care that borders on obsession. They are no longer weapons. They are survivors. Modern pilots describe flying the Mustang as stepping into another era. There are no digital displays, no fly-by-wire systems, no safety net. Every movement is mechanical. Every mistake is personal. The aircraft demands discipline. Torque pulls hard on takeoff. Visibility is limited. Engine temperatures must be watched constantly. The Mustang does not forgive complacency. Yet that challenge is exactly what draws people to it. Owners spend millions restoring airframes to flying condition. Mechanics fabricate parts by hand when originals no longer exist. Entire communities form around keeping these machines alive. At airshows, the effect is immediate. When a Mustang starts its engine, the crowd changes. Conversations stop. Phones lower. People listen. Because the sound is not just noise. It is memory. It echoes with the escort of bombers over Germany, with strafing runs in Korea, with post-war races that flirted with disaster, with decades of preservation against the odds. Every flight is a balancing act between honor and risk. Pilots know that one mechanical failure can be fatal. Yet they fly anyway, not for profit, not for combat, but for remembrance, because grounding the Mustang would mean losing something irreplaceable. The aircraft has outlived its creators. It has outlived the war that gave it purpose. And in doing so, it has become more than aluminum and horsepower. It has become a reminder that technology can shape history, that courage has a cost, and that some machines carry the weight of an entire generation. The P-51 Mustang still flies, and as long as it does, the story of those who built it, maintained it, and fought in it will never truly end. The P-51 Mustang was built as a high-altitude escort fighter. It was designed to dominate the skies over Europe, protect bombers, and engage enemy aircraft. But in Korea, it found itself in a role it was never meant to play. Pilots flew low over battlefields, strafing tanks, trucks, and supply lines. Every bullet that pierced the radiator could end the mission, and their lives. Engineers who had designed the Mustang watched with frustration. The aircraft excelled at 25,000 feet, not at a few hundred feet, dodging anti-aircraft fire. Yet the Mustang performed. It flew where jets could not. It stayed longer over targets. It supported ground forces when modern aircraft failed. The war demanded adaptability, and the Mustang delivered despite being misused. Its high-altitude fighter design became a low-level warrior. This period of improvised service would cost many pilots their lives, but it also cemented the Mustang's reputation as versatile, resilient, and indispensable, even when flown the wrong way. The Mustangs were not just symbols of air superiority, they were the workhorses of the new Israeli Air Force. Flying over Damascus, Cairo, and the front lines, they performed reconnaissance missions that no other aircraft could. Long-range flights brought intelligence from deep behind enemy lines. But reconnaissance was only part of their job. The Mustangs were armed, agile, and lethal. In January 1949, just days before the final ceasefire of the War of Independence, Mustangs escorted light attack aircraft and encountered Egyptian fighters. Outnumbered but superior in speed and firepower, the Mustangs engaged and shot down 3 enemy planes in a single mission. For the young pilots, many of them volunteers from abroad, every sortie was a test of skill, courage, and nerve. They had to master a foreign land, a tiny air force, and an aircraft that demanded respect. The Mustang's Merlin engine allowed them to outfly opponents, extend patrols, and strike far behind enemy lines. No other plane in Israel's inventory could match it. Every mission sent a clear message: Israel could defend itself. And every enemy pilot who looked up and saw the Mustang coming knew danger had arrived from the sky. The P-51 had become more than a fighter. It had become a force multiplier, a reconnaissance platform, and a guardian. Its presence alone changed the dynamics of the battlefield, instilling fear where once there had been confidence. By October 1956, the P-51 Mustangs had been pushed into storage, seemingly retired from frontline service. But Israel, France, and Britain had secretly planned a coordinated attack on Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Israel needed its long-range fighters, and the Mustangs were ready. Pulled from storage, the Mustangs were tasked with a mission unlike any they had flown before. Their objective: destroy Egyptian aircraft at distant airfields and cut the enemy's communications across the Sinai Desert. Flying at treetop level, so low that sand and rocks whipped past their propellers, the pilots faced almost certain death. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the desert itself would claim them. Special devices were designed to sever Egyptian telephone lines. Weighted cables dragged behind the aircraft. When some failed, the pilots did not abort. They flew even lower, slicing the lines with the wings and propeller. It was an act of daring, precision, and sheer bravery. The operation succeeded. Egyptian command and control systems were crippled, paratroopers dropped safely at Mitla Pass, and the Mustangs had proved yet again their versatility in a world that was rapidly leaving propeller fighters behind. From high-altitude escort fighters to low-level communication disruptors, the Mustang had adapted to every challenge. In the Sinai, it had become more than a plane, it had become a weapon of ingenuity and fear. After the tragic crash of Bill Odom in 1949, the golden age of Cleveland air racing ended. Surplus Mustangs were grounded. They sat in hangars, abandoned tie-down lines, or storage field. For 15 years, the roar of Merlin engines was silent in competitive air racing. But in 1964, a showman named Bill Stead saw an opportunity to bring it back. In the Nevada desert, far from residential neighborhoods, Stead partnered with ABC's Wide World of Sports and local casino owners in Reno. The result: a spectacular revival of air racing, with the P-51 Mustang at its center. The Warbirds came out of storage, restored and modified, ready to fly faster than ever. Pilots, some too young to have fought in the war, discovered the thrill of racing aircraft that had once dominated the skies over Europe. Mustangs with names like Straga, Voodoo, and Red became legends. Speeds exceeded 450 miles per hour, surpassing what the aircraft had ever flown during wartime. The Reno races were more than a competition, they were a tribute, a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the enduring legacy of the P-51 Mustang. What had once been a deadly weapon of war became a symbol of speed, skill, and the love of flight. After World War II, the P-51 Mustang was no longer just an American icon. It became a global fighter, serving in dozens of air forces across 6 continents. In the Philippines, over 100 Mustangs became the backbone of the post-war Philippine Army Air Corps, later forming the core of the Philippine Air Force. Pilots flew them against communist insurgents and local rebellions, proving the Mustang's versatility in counterinsurgency operations. Indonesia acquired Mustangs from the departing Netherlands East Indies Air Force, using them in multiple rebellions during the 1950s. On May 18, 1958, an Indonesian Mustang scored a rare aerial victory, shooting down a B-26 Invader piloted by a CIA contract pilot, the only confirmed air-to-air kill in the nation's history. Guatemala, Haiti, and Sweden also incorporated Mustangs into their fleet. Sweden's J-26 and S-26 variants undertook secret reconnaissance over Soviet installations along the Baltic coast in 1946–47. The Mustang's speed allowed it to evade Soviet interceptors, performing missions that few other aircraft could accomplish safely. Even in China, Mustangs fought in the Civil War. Nationalist pilots retreated to Taiwan with their aircraft, while the Communists captured a handful to display in military parade. From Asia to the Caribbean, Africa to Central America, the Mustang became the fighter of choice for nations that needed performance, reliability, and adaptability, long after its original combat role had ended. Its reach was global, its influence lasting, and its presence on the world stage undeniable. In 1948, the Dominican Republic received its first P-51 Mustangs. Initially flown by Brazilian mercenaries, these aircraft trained over 100 Dominican pilots in just 2 years. By the early 1950s, the Dominicans had expanded their fleet, acquiring additional Mustangs, including Swedish F-51DS. These fighters became the backbone of Dominican air power for over 3 decades, distinguished by brightly painted schemes and shark-mouth nose art. The Mustangs proved themselves in combat multiple times. During the 1959 Constanza invasion, they repelled exiles attempting to overthrow the Trujillo dictatorship. 6 years later, in the April Revolution of 1965, Mustangs flew alongside American forces during Operation Power Pack, supporting ground operations with precise strafing and bombing runs. Even as jets emerged worldwide, the Dominican Mustangs endured. They were the only armed fighters available in the 1970s, defending airspace with courage and skill. In 1983, when a Cuban intelligence ship violated Dominican waters, Mustangs strafed the vessel until it withdrew, demonstrating that the aircraft still commanded respect. The last operational Dominican Mustangs were retired in 1984, 40 years after the first arrived, a remarkable lifespan for a plane designed in just 102 days to meet urgent wartime demands. Through wars, revolutions, and border disputes, the Mustang had proven time and again that it could adapt, survive, and dominate far beyond its expected service life. By July 1969, the P-51 Mustang was nearing the end of its combat career, yet it was about to make history one last time. In Central America, tensions between El Salvador and Honduras had boiled over into conflict. The so-called football war erupted after years of simmering disputes over land, immigration, and political tensions, triggered by the June 1969 World Cup qualifying matches. Both nations fielded outdated air forces. Honduras flew F-4U Corsairs, while El Salvador relied on a mix of Goodyear-built FG-1D Corsairs and Cavalier-upgraded P-51 Mustangs. These modernized Mustangs, equipped with improved engines, avionics, and wingtip fuel tanks, gave El Salvador a fighting chance. The opening engagement was chaotic. On July 17, 1969, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force flew his 4th mission of the day in an F-4U-5 Corsair. He encountered 2 Salvadoran Cavalier Mustangs piloted by Captains Douglas Varela and Leonel Lovo. A fierce dogfight ensued. In minutes, the Mustangs had destroyed Varela and Lovo's aircraft, but Soto and his wingmen counterattacked, shooting down 2 more enemy planes. Soto scored 3 confirmed aerial victories that day, the last in history between propeller-driven fighters. The war ended the next day with a ceasefire brokered by the Organization of American States. Over 3,000 lives were lost, tens of thousands displaced, and the world witnessed the final chapter of piston-engine aerial combat. The P-51 Mustang had survived decades of innovation, conflict, and obsolescence, proving that even in the age of jets, a properly flown Warbird could still dominate the skies. Ed Maloney was just a teenager in 1945 when he witnessed the destruction of thousands of warplanes at Calero Field in Chino, California. B-17s, B-24s, and P-51 Mustangs were being cut apart, their fuselages smashed by steel plates. That experience left a mark on him. He vowed to save as many aircraft as he could, no matter how difficult. With limited funds, he began acquiring old Warbirds, trading, restoring, and storing them carefully. By 1957, Maloney opened his collection to the public, the first aviation museum west of the Rockies. Over time, his museum moved and expanded, becoming the Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino. Here, the Mustangs were preserved not as static displays, but as living, flying history. Maloney was not alone. Across the United States, former pilots, mechanics, and enthusiasts began rescuing Mustangs from junkyards, foreign air forces, and abandoned airfields. They learned to maintain Merlin engines, track down spare parts, and restore these aircraft to airworthy condition. What had once been obsolete machinery became priceless history. By the 1960s and 70s, these restored Mustangs were not just museum pieces. They were flying tributes to the pilots, engineers, and nations that had relied on them. Ed Maloney's lifelong dedication ensured that the Mustang would survive, not just as a relic, but as a living symbol of aviation history and human ingenuity. After the grounding of surplus Mustangs in 1950, air racing went quiet. The tragedy of Bill Odom's crash in Cleveland had ended the golden era of pylon racing, and for over a decade, the Warbirds sat idle, their engines silent. In 1964, a new chapter began. Boat racing champion Bill Stead envisioned reviving air racing in Nevada, on a high plateau far from cities. Partnering with ABC's Wide World of Sports and Reno casinos, Stead secured a venue at Sky Ranch Airport, 5,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by mountains. Mustangs returned to the skies. Pilots, many too young to have flown in World War II, now raced these legendary fighters at unprecedented speed. Aircraft were heavily modified, armor and armament stripped, airframes smoothed, engines tuned beyond wartime limits. Legends were born. Mustangs with names like Straga, Voodoo, and Red became household names in the air racing community. Speeds regularly exceeded 450 miles per hour, faster than any Mustang had flown in combat. The Reno races became the world's premier unlimited-class air racing event. This revival was more than sport, it was preservation in motion. Every turn, every lap, kept the Mustang's legacy alive, proving that even decades after the war, this fighter still had wings to spare. While Mustangs thrilled spectators in Reno, they were still in active service across the globe. In the Philippines, over 100 Mustangs formed the backbone of the post-war Air Force. Filipino pilots flew them against communist insurgents and Moro rebels throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. These aircraft became the centerpiece of the Blue Diamonds, the Philippine Air Demonstration Team, formed in 1953. Indonesia also maintained Mustangs long after World War II. Acquired from the Netherlands East Indies Air Force in 1949–50, they were deployed in counterinsurgency operations, including the CIA-backed Permesta Rebellion of 1958. Notably, an Indonesian Mustang achieved the only confirmed air-to-air kill in the nation's history, shooting down a B-26 Invader piloted by a U.S. contractor. Central America saw Mustangs in action as well. Guatemala, Haiti, and other countries flew them in internal conflicts and border skirmishes. Sweden used its fleet for secret reconnaissance missions along the Soviet Baltic coast, a testament to the Mustang's enduring performance. Even as jets became standard, nations with limited budgets or rugged terrain relied on the Mustang. Its ability to operate from short, rough airstrips, carry ordnance, and remain on station for hours ensured it remained relevant far longer than anyone imagined. The Mustang had truly become a global warrior, serving across continents in conflicts both large and small, adapting to every mission demanded of it. By 1969, the P-51 Mustang was on the verge of retirement worldwide, but it would fight one last time in Central America. The conflict between El Salvador and Honduras, sparked by long-standing territorial and immigration disputes and inflamed by the June 1969 World Cup qualifiers, escalated into what became known as the Football War. Both air forces were relics of World War II. Honduras flew F-4U Corsairs, while El Salvador relied on a small fleet of Cavalier-upgraded Mustangs and Corsairs. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador's Mustangs began striking Honduran airfields and ground forces. The aerial battles that followed marked the last dogfights ever fought between propeller-driven aircraft in history. Mustangs and Corsairs engaged in low-altitude strafing, bombing, and evasive maneuvers over jungle terrain. On July 17, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force scored multiple victories flying an F-4U-5 Corsair, while El Salvador's Mustang pilots, Douglas Varela and Leonel Lovo, engaged in deadly aerial duels. In minutes, several aircraft were destroyed, and the final chapter of piston engine combat was written in fire and smoke. The war lasted only 100 hours. Over 3,000 lives were lost, tens of thousands were displaced, and history witnessed a final echo of World War II-era dogfighting. The Mustang had proven itself in combat from Europe to Asia to the Americas. The Mustang's combat career had finally come full circle, ending not in Europe or Korea, but over the jungles of Central America, a testament to its unmatched adaptability and enduring legacy. While the Mustang's combat days ended, its story was far from over. Ed Maloney, who had first witnessed the destruction of thousands of aircraft in 1945, had dedicated his life to saving them. Over decades, he built a museum that would become a sanctuary for Mustangs and other Warbird. His Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, displayed aircraft in flying condition, allowing visitors to experience history in motion. Across America and the world, enthusiasts, restorers, and former pilots joined the effort. Crash sites were scoured for salvageable airframes, parts were reverse-engineered, and Merlin engines, long out of production, were painstakingly maintained. The Mustang, once obsolete, became a centerpiece of the Warbird movement. By the 1960s and 70s, restored Mustangs were selling for tens of thousands of dollars. Today, airworthy examples command millions. Museums, airshows, and film productions showcase these fighters, with meticulous attention to authenticity. Checkerboard tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, red noses of the 4th Fighter Group, and blue-striped markings of the 357th. Restored Mustangs carry the names of pilots who flew them in combat: KRYPS Mighty, Sierra Sioux II, and Man-O-War, preserving not just machines, but the stories, bravery, and legacy of those who flew them. Through the dedication of Maloney, Steve Hinton Sr., Stephen Hinton Jr., and countless restorers worldwide, the P-51 Mustang has transcended its original purpose, living on as a symbol of aviation history and human ingenuity. Today, the P-51 Mustang is more than a legendary fighter, it is a living icon of aviation history. Over 160 airworthy Mustangs soar around the world, with more than 200 registered in the United States. They race at Reno, dazzle crowds at airshows from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, to Wanaka, New Zealand, and star in films like Top Gun: Maverick, flown by Tom Cruise himself. Restorers painstakingly maintain authenticity, reinstalling armor plating, decommissioned guns, and period radios alongside modern avionics. Each aircraft tells a story. The Mustang's triumphs in World War II, Korea, Israel, Central America, and countless other conflicts. Modern pilots push these warbirds to their limits. Racing Mustangs exceed 450 miles per hour, while record-breaking flights, like Doug Matthews' 2013 climb to 42,568 feet in the Rebel, prove the Mustang's engineering brilliance endures decades after it was first built. The sound of the Merlin engine, a howl of 12 cylinders at full power, still fills the sky, a living tribute to the men who flew it, the engineers who built it, and the enthusiasts who refused to let it die. The P-51 Mustang, designed in 102 days to meet a wartime need, has outlived wars, pilots, and nations. It remains a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and timeless courage, proving that some machines do more than fly, they inspire.